My parents were seated at a small table near the exit while strangers filled the front rows. When I asked why, my mother-in-law smiled and said, "Some people don't belong in the spotlight." My fiancé shrugged that I kept quiet, but the next morning their lives began to fall apart because my parents were seated at a small table near the exit while strangers filled the front rows. I noticed it the moment I walked into the reception hall. The stage was decorated with white flowers and soft lights. The long tables closest to us were already packed with people I barely knew. My fiancé's parents had invited business partners, investors, and people whose names I had only heard once or twice. Then I saw my mom and dad. Their table was pushed almost against the emergency door. 2 folding chairs had been added to the side like an afterthought. A waiter walked past them 3 times without stopping. My mother sat with her hands folded on the tablecloth. My father kept glancing around the room like he was waiting for someone to tell him he was in the wrong place. I walked over. "Why are you sitting here?" I asked. My mom gave a small smile. "It's fine. Your future mother-in-law said these seats were quieter." I turned around and walked straight to the front tables. My future mother-in-law, Linda, was standing beside the bar with 2 women in expensive dresses. She saw me and smiled immediately. "Patricia, everything looks wonderful, doesn't it?" I asked her why my parents were sitting near the exit. He didn't hesitate. "Some people don't belong in the spotlight." She said it like it was obvious. One of the women next to her laughed softly. I stood there for a second before looking at Daniel, my fiancé. He was scrolling through his phone like he hadn't heard anything. "Did you know about this?" I asked. He glanced toward the exit where my parents were sitting. "They're probably more comfortable there," he said. My parents arranged the seating. That was it. No argument. No surprise. Just a shrug. I went back to my parents' table and sat with them for a while. My father asked if the food would be served soon. My mom kept telling me not to worry and that the place looked beautiful. But something had already changed for me. For the first time, I started paying attention to the things Daniel's parents said when they thought no one important was listening. Later that night, while everyone was drinking champagne near the stage, I passed by the hallway that led to the offices behind the reception hall. I heard my future father-in-law talking inside one of the rooms. He was on the phone. "I told you," he said, "the numbers don't go through the main account. They never have." There was a short pause. Then he laughed. "The government only sees what we want them to see." I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there and listened to everything. And that was the moment I realized something important. My future in-laws had spent years humiliating people like my parents because of money. But the money they were so proud of wasn't clean. And once I knew that, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If their entire world was built on secrets, then all it would take was the right person opening the wrong folder. And I already knew exactly where that folder was. After that night, I couldn't look at Daniel's parents the same way. Before, I had always assumed their cold attitude toward my family came from arrogance. They were rich, my parents weren't. That was the entire explanation I gave myself. But now I knew something else. Their confidence came from believing no one could touch them. For the rest of the evening, I kept watching them. Linda walked around greeting guests like she owned the building. My future father-in-law, Robert, stood near the stage with a group of men in suits. Every few minutes someone laughed loudly at something he said. Meanwhile, my parents quietly ate their dinner near the exit. I saw my dad fold the napkin carefully before standing up to throw away a plate. He didn't realize there were waiters assigned for that. Something about that moment made my chest feel tight. Later that night, when the guests started leaving, Daniel and I finally had a moment alone. "Did you notice where my parents were seated?" I asked. He looked confused for a second. "They seemed fine. They were at a table by the exit." Daniel shrugged again. "My parents probably organized everything based on the guest list. Most of the people in front are important for the business." "Important?" I stared at him. "My parents are important to me." He looked irritated. "Patricia, don't start a fight over seating arrangements." That was when I stopped talking. Not because I agreed with him. Because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Daniel had grown up in the same world as his parents. To him, everything that happened that evening made sense. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Daniel was still asleep beside me. My phone buzzed with a message from my mom. She had sent a photo. It was a picture of her and my dad in front of their small house. My dad was holding a shovel and smiling like he always did after finishing work in the yard. The message said one sentence. "We're proud of you." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I remembered the conversation I had overheard in the hallway. "The numbers don't go through the main account. The government only sees what we want them to see." At first I told myself it wasn't my problem. Families argue all the time. Maybe things would get better after the wedding. But the more I thought about it, the more details started connecting in my head. Over the past 2 years I had visited Robert's office dozens of times. I had seen documents on his desk. Financial reports. Boxes of records stacked against the wall. Once he even asked me to grab a folder from the storage room. At the time it meant nothing. Now I remembered exactly where everything was kept. That afternoon Daniel left to meet a client with his father. Linda went shopping with friends. Their house was completely empty. I sat in my car outside their office building for almost 10 minutes before going inside. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mr. Carter's office?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't ask any questions. When I walked into Robert's office, everything looked exactly the same as always. The large desk, the glass shelves, and the door that led to the storage room behind the office. My hands were shaking a little when I opened it. Inside were rows of gray filing cabinets and cardboard boxes filled with documents. At first I didn't know what I was looking for. Then I saw something strange. 2 folders with the same company name. One was thin. The other was almost overflowing with papers. I opened the thin one first. It contained the official financial records. Then I opened the second one. The numbers inside were completely different. And that was only the beginning. Because the deeper I looked into those files, the more I realized Daniel's parents weren't just hiding money. They had been running the same scheme for years. And I was now standing in a room full of proof. For a long time I just stood there in the storage room holding the folder. I kept expecting someone to walk in and ask what I was doing. But the office was silent. The first thing I noticed was how organized everything was. Robert wasn't careless. Each folder had dates, project names, and notes written in his handwriting. 2 systems existed for almost every transaction. One set of documents showed moderate profits, normal expenses, and taxes that looked perfectly legal. The second set showed the real numbers. Payments moved through accounts that didn't appear anywhere in the official records. Contracts were duplicated with altered amounts. Some companies listed in the paperwork didn't even seem real. I sat down on the floor and kept reading. Every few pages I saw another signature. Robert's. Sometimes Linda's. My stomach started to twist. This wasn't one mistake or a few hidden payments. It was a complete system. Something they had built carefully over years. One file caught my attention more than the others. Inside were letters from accountants and advisors warning Robert that what he was doing could lead to serious legal problems if anyone investigated. Next to those letters were Robert's responses. Short notes written in pen. Handled. Already moved. Not traceable. I realized something else while reading. Daniel had signed a few documents too. Not many, but enough to show he knew parts of the system existed. I closed the folder slowly. For a moment I imagined walking back upstairs, putting everything back where it belonged and pretending none of this had happened. It would be the easiest choice. The wedding would go ahead. My parents would keep being polite around people who looked down on them. Daniel's family would continue acting like they were untouchable. And no one would ever know what I had seen. But the image of my parents sitting at that small table near the exit kept returning to my mind. My father looking around the room. My mother telling me everything was fine. I reached for my phone. At first I only took pictures of a few pages. Then I stopped. Pictures could be explained away. I needed more than that. So I started building a folder. I copied files, scanned documents with my phone, and photographed entire stacks of paperwork. Every piece of evidence that clearly showed the difference between the official records and the real ones. It took almost 2 hours. When I finally finished, the folder on my phone contained hundreds of images. Enough to explain everything. I placed the documents back exactly the way I had found them. When I stepped outside the building, the afternoon sun felt strange on my face. My phone felt heavy in my hand. That evening Daniel came home talking about a new investment his father was planning. I listened quietly while he spoke. At one point he asked why I seemed distracted. "Just tired," I said. But inside my mind one thought kept repeating. All it would take was one message, one email, one anonymous report, and the entire world Daniel's parents had built would begin collapsing. The question that kept bothering me wasn't whether I could do it. The question was something else. How far was I actually willing to go? For 3 days I did nothing. The folder on my phone sat there like a secret that refused to leave my mind. I still went through the normal routine. Dinner with Daniel. Calls with my parents. Planning details for the wedding. But every time Daniel mentioned his family business, I thought about the storage room. About those 2 sets of numbers. About the way Robert had written "not traceable" beside one of the transactions. On the 4th evening we went to his parents' house for dinner. Linda greeted us at the door like always. Patricia, we invited a few people tonight. Important partners. The dining room was already full when we walked in. Expensive wine, polished glasses, quiet conversations about investments and contracts. I noticed something immediately. Every guest had a name card at the table. Everyone except my parents. Linda leaned toward me while we were sitting down. By the way, she said, next time your parents visit, tell them the garden entrance is easier. The front door is usually crowded during events. I looked at her. The garden entrance? She nodded casually. It's more appropriate. For a moment I didn't say anything. Then dinner started. Robert spent most of the evening talking about how difficult it was to run a successful company in a country where taxes were so high. Several of the guests agreed with him. Daniel laughed along with them. At one point Robert raised his glass. To people who know how to build something valuable. Everyone clinked glasses. I took a small sip of wine and looked around the table. They all looked comfortable, confident, untouchable. That night when we returned home, Daniel fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake in the living room with my laptop. The folder on my phone had already been copied to the computer. Hundreds of images, contracts, account numbers, internal reports. I organized them into categories: undeclared income, fake invoices, shell companies. By midnight everything was arranged in a single file. All that remained was choosing where to send it. I searched for the website of the tax authority. There was a section for anonymous reports. They even provided instructions for submitting evidence. For a long time my finger hovered over the keyboard. Once I sent it, there would be no way to undo it. Daniel's parents could lose everything. Their company, their reputation, maybe even their freedom. But then another memory appeared in my mind. My parents sitting quietly at that table near the exit while strangers filled the front rows. Some people don't belong in the spotlight. That was what Linda had said. I looked at the screen again. Then I attached the file. The upload bar slowly moved across the screen. 30%, 50%, 80%. My heart was beating so loudly I could hear it in the quiet apartment. Finally the screen changed. Report submitted successfully. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence. Nothing felt different. No alarms. No phone calls. No sudden consequences. Just a quiet apartment in the middle of the night. But somewhere inside a government office, a system had just received a file large enough to destroy an entire business. And the next morning, the first call arrived. The call came at 7:12 in the morning. Daniel was in the shower when his phone started ringing on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen. It stopped after a few seconds. Then it rang again. And again. By the 4th call I answered. Hello. For a moment there was silence. Then Robert's voice. Where's Daniel? He's in the shower. Tell him to call me immediately. He hung up before I could respond. Daniel walked into the kitchen a minute later drying his hair with a towel. I told him his father had called several times. He dialed back right away. I watched his face slowly change as he listened. What do you mean investigators? He asked. There was a long pause. They're at the office right now? Another pause. Looking at what documents? Daniel's eyes moved toward me for a moment before he turned away. Hey, I'm coming. He ended the call and grabbed his jacket. What happened? I asked. He looked confused. Some kind of tax inspection. Dad says they showed up with a warrant. My heart stayed completely calm. When? I asked. This morning. He rushed out the door without finishing breakfast. The apartment was quiet again. About an hour later my phone started buzzing. Messages were appearing in a group chat Daniel's family used. They're taking computers. Lawyers are on the way. Someone reported us. I placed the phone down on the table. Outside, the morning looked completely normal. But across the city, inside Robert's office building, men in dark jackets were opening filing cabinets. And sooner or later, they were going to reach the storage room. By the afternoon, the news had already started spreading. Not on television yet, but in the circles Daniel's parents cared about. Investors were calling. 2 partners canceled meetings. Someone in the group chat wrote that the authorities had sealed part of the office. Daniel came home late that evening looking exhausted. They copied everything, he said. Computers, records, contracts. He sat down at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a while. My dad thinks someone inside the company betrayed him. I stayed quiet. The next morning things got worse. One of their bank accounts was frozen. By noon, several business partners had already stepped away from their agreements. Daniel's phone kept buzzing with messages. Then Linda called him. I heard part of the conversation from the other room. They're talking about criminal charges, she said through the speaker. Daniel didn't respond for a long time. That evening he asked me one strange question. Do you think someone close to us could have done this? I looked at him. I don't know, I said. And technically, that answer wasn't a lie. Because what Daniel didn't know yet was that the investigation had only just begun. The folder I sent contained enough evidence to start the collapse. But the investigators were now digging deeper. And once they finished going through every account, every contract, every hidden company, Daniel's parents wouldn't just lose their business. They would lose everything they had built their lives around. And the most surprising part was this. Even while their world was falling apart, they still had no idea who had opened the door for it to happen.